Our New Testament lesson today comes from the Gospel according to Matthew, from the 14th chapter. And the first few words of the scripture lesson says, "Now when Jesus heard this," and what Jesus had heard was that his cousin John the Baptist had been horrendously murdered. His head was beheaded, and he was looking for some solace, some solitude. He's looking for a place where he could withdraw to, a deserted place. But as you will hear in the lesson, those plans are interrupted. So listen for the word from Matthew the 14th chapter, verses 13 through 21. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled, and they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full, and those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. This morning I want to talk to you about miracles. Is the impossible ever possible? A minister was making a home visit to one of the younger families in his parish. A 5-year-old boy answered the front door and told the minister his mother would be down shortly. To make some conversation, the minister asked the little guy, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" The boy immediately answered, "I'd like to be possible." "What do you mean by that?" the puzzled minister asked. "Well, you see," the boy replied, "just about every day my mom tells me I'm impossible. Just once I'd like to be thought of as possible." At times children can indeed seem impossible, but I think it's safe to say that it's impossible not to love them. Our gospel lesson this morning causes us to reflect on things in life that are possible. Miracles, for instance. Are miracles really possible? Are miracles something that used to take place back in biblical times but somehow have disappeared with the advent of the scientific age? Maybe the problem isn't so much that miracles don't occur as much as we used to see them, or back in biblical times. Maybe it's just simply a matter of not knowing where to look for miracles. In our gospel lesson today, we are witnesses to one of Jesus' most familiar miracles, the feeding of the 5,000. The importance of this story in the New Testament writers, or to the New Testament writers, is reflected in the fact that outside of the resurrection, the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle of Jesus that appears in all 4 of the New Testament Gospels. The frequency with which this miracle is reported is indicative of the importance the New Testament authors tied to this story. Not only is this a story of Christ's power and miraculous ability, it is also a story of Christ's grace and compassion. The placement of this story in Matthew's Gospel is also important. In the previous chapter, Matthew records Jesus teaching about the kingdom of heaven using multiple parables. There we find the parable of the wheat and the weeds, the parable of the mustard seed, and the parable of the merchant in search of fine pearls, just to name a few, all parables pointing to a kingdom of justice and mercy and care for one another. And then suddenly, Matthew shares a breaking news story of how John the Baptist was horrendously murdered, all because of a vow the king made to a dancing girl. When Jesus finds out about the death of his cousin, he withdraws from the crowds to be by himself to mourn the death of John. So he gets into a boat and heads off to a secluded destination, but the crowds who had been following him discovered where he was going and were waiting for him as he arrived. According to Matthew, when Jesus saw the crowd, he had compassion for them and began healing their sick. Matthew's juxtaposition of the wonderful blessings of the kingdom of heaven contrasted against the cruel reality of the kingdom of this world was no accident. On the one hand, we are witnesses to the cruel and heartless example of the kingdom of the world, in which an innocent person is selfishly murdered. On the other hand, we learn about a far better kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, in which Jesus was able to set aside his own desires and needs for the benefit of those who needed his help. What a wonderful glimpse of the kingdom of heaven. Jesus spent the better part of the day engaged in healing those who were sick. Evening was upon them, and the disciples approached Jesus, demanding that he dismiss the crowds so that they could go into the villages to buy their dinner. They had made no arrangements to have dinner catered, and since they were in a deserted place, they had no visible means of providing a meal for this 5,000 plus crowd. But not providing food for the hungry was totally unacceptable to Jesus. Rather abruptly, Jesus tells the disciples, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. I can only imagine how disheartened the disciples were. They didn't want to disappoint their teacher, but their resources were too limited, or so they thought. Their reply, we have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. The disciples were thinking in worldly terms and in human thoughts. They failed to make allowance for the power and the ability of the Son of God. Jesus knew exactly what he was going to do. He took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he looked up, he said a prayer, he said grace, he broke the bread and gave it to his disciples. Amazingly, everyone ate and were filled, and the disciples were able to collect 12 baskets full of leftovers. We could, I suppose, fixate on how Jesus accomplished this miracle, but to what end? Regardless of how the miracle occurred, the lesson we learn from this story is profound. Jesus used this event to teach the crowd and his disciples about the Christian life. Jesus said to the disciples, you give them something to eat. Jesus made it clear that he regarded the feeding task to be their responsibility as it is ours today. Certainly Jesus could have fed the crowd by himself if that had been his desire, just as God in the Old Testament had brought forth manna in the wilderness. But Jesus elected to involve the disciples because that's what it means to be a servant people. That's what it means to be the people of God. It's that whole last shall be first thing. It's that whole take up your cross to follow Jesus. When the disciples were told, you give them something to eat, they were unaware that they had the resources to fulfill Jesus' command. They didn't know it, but they did have something. They had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and a desire to help others and be obedient servants to their master. Jesus' point is clear. You give what you have, and I will use it and multiply it and redistribute it for the good of God's kingdom. In the movie City Slickers, we are introduced to 3 middle-aged men who are in a constant state of a midlife crisis. They're tired of their jobs, they're tired of their routines, They're tired, just in general, just tired of their ordinary life. In an effort to break away from the monotony of life as usual, they learn about an opportunity to sign up for a real live Western cattle drive. They had no experience with horses or riding and no particular gift with regard to animal science or living in the great outdoors. But they opened themselves up to being trained in riding and roping and living on the range. Eventually, the actual cattle drive began. And as they faced storms and stampedes and raging rivers, with each catastrophe and failure, they gained confidence and ability. Ultimately, they faced their greatest challenge. The foreman dies, the hired hands quit, and the only ones left to bring in the herd are these three self-professed city slickers. But with desire and determination and God's help, they overcome insurmountable odds and bring the cattle in safely. In the end, they were amazed at what they were able to accomplish. God had taken the little talent and knowledge they had and multiplied it for the benefit of all. Closer to home, the Society of St. Andrew was started by two pastors, Reverend Ken Horn and Reverend Ray Buchanan, two United Methodist ministers concerned with world hunger. In 1979, the two ministers were granted a special appointment beyond the local church for the purpose of developing the Society of St. Andrew in Big Allen, Virginia, a society dedicated to feeding the hungry. The Society of St. Andrew, they lived there on the Big Allen. For the next 5 years, the two pastors and their families lived together in order to model a simpler lifestyle that rejected consumerism by growing their own vegetables, raising sheep, chickens, and rabbits. And at the same time, the two pastors led workshops on responsible lifestyles and hunger issues. Out of one of those workshops, a grassroots discussion concerning the reclamation of salvageable vegetables was held on June 3rd, 1983. A farmer from Chadbourne, North Carolina, donated a tractor-trailer load of sweet potatoes to the Society of St. Andrews, which was delivered to the Central Virginia Food Bank in Richmond, Virginia. Since that time, millions of pounds of produce have been saved and distributed to area food banks. According to their website, in 2019, the Society of St. Andrew Gleaning Network of volunteers collected and distributed over 13 million pounds of fresh produce to feed the hungry. Does the work of the Society of St. Andrew fall under the heading of a miracle? You be the judge. Those coin boxes we collect every year at Easter makes a difference. With God's help, we contribute to a miracle. When the disciples were faced with a situation of overwhelming odds, the disciples immediately began to think particularly practically. As they did the math and realized that they didn't have the resources to do the job. But Jesus taught a different kind of math, based not on addition, but on multiplication. The disciples are thinking scarcity. Jesus thinks in terms of abundance. It's as though Jesus was saying to his disciples, don't tell me what you don't have. Show me what you have. Bring what you have here to me, says Jesus, and I will multiply what you give me and make a miracle. Whether it's time or money donated to the Salvation Army or daily bread or Habitat for Humanity or the Free Clinic of Central Virginia or the food baskets our service committees fills out and distributes at Thanksgiving, Easter, and Christmas, or the cookies distributed to the homebound. Jesus can take our assets and multiply it and make a miracle. And it's not always food and money that makes a miracle. When people come to you seeking life's hard questions, what's the meaning of life? Why do I exist? Is there anything beyond this life? Don't send them away empty-handed. You give them something to eat. Share with them the love and the knowledge of new life available in Jesus Christ. In Jesus Christ, there is more than enough grace to go around. As we come to the table this morning, we are reminded of the Passover meal Jesus shared with his disciples. Jesus uses almost the same actions and words at the feeding of the 5,000 as he does at the Last Supper. We are told that prior to the distribution of the bread, Jesus took the bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to his disciples. Clearly, this was a foreshadowing of the meal he would share with his disciples later in Jerusalem, and a reminder that Jesus has the power to make the impossible possible. Like the little boy who wanted his mother to call him possible, let us strive to make the impossible possible by allowing Jesus to use the gifts we have, no matter how meager or how small, to make a miracle. Let Jesus use you as an instrument of his compassion and grace. To God be the glory. Amen.